Good evening, fellow councillors, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this council meeting. A special welcome for 3 of our 4 independent and cooperative members of the Standards Committee who are here to see firsthand how things work in this chamber. Welcome too to all those in public gallery and those watching the webcast. Item 1, have we got any apologies?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I offer apologies on behalf of Councillor Jennings and Councillor Yvonne Williams?
Councillor Roberts.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. An apology from Councillor Sarah Russell, and hopefully our 2 others will arrive, but Councillor Sandhu and Councillor Redfern both have problems getting here.
Okay. Item 2, declarations of interest. The monitoring officer has issued a dispensation for all members to enable debate on council tax at item 10 and the members' allowance scheme at item 11. Are there any other declarations?
Mr. Mayor, yes, I have a declaration of interest in the Marble Hall site. I am a current employee of Rolls-Royce, and as you are aware, that building was owned by Rolls-Royce.
Item 3, minutes of the meeting of 29 January. Have we got a proposer and a seconder?
Move, Mr. Mayor.
Those for the minutes? Seconded? It's carried. Item 4, announcements from the Mayor. I have a number of items. Firstly, some congratulations on events that have happened since we last met. 2 involving gentlemen seated on this platform. Our Chief Executive turned 50 in the middle of last month, in fact, on St. Valentine's Day. On that very same day, our leader, Councillor Bayliss, got married to Paula. And he has only this week returned from the honeymoon. Congratulations to Adam and Paul. Congratulations also to Bombardier on the wonderful news that they have won the prestigious Crossrail contract. It was my pleasure and privilege to host a civic reception in their honour last Friday. We will have an opportunity to learn more about the importance of the company's success during the debate later in this meeting. This will be the last meeting of the Council before the local elections on 22nd of May, at which 17 of our 51 Council seats will be contested. Can I take this opportunity to wish all those who are seeking re-election well, and to say thank you to Councillor Lorraine Radford and for her services to Darley Ward this past 4 years. The time demands of Lorraine's increasing successful business mean she is not seeking re-election. Thanks also to Councillor Faye Winter, and who is also retiring after 11 years, representing Mikulova Ward. Yes, Councillor.
I'd just like to say a few words, both about Faye Winter and Councillor Lorraine Radford. I'll speak about Faye first of all, if that's okay. Councillor Faye Winter is one of those councillors who actually cares for the ward, Derby City, and its residents. She made me realise when I was a new councillor that the opposition don't bite, and that we can still work together despite having different core values. So it's with great sadness that I have to say goodbye to someone who has become a friend. We have worked very well together, And our very first council event, which I shall always remember, was the Muslim Women's Party in Normanton 4 years ago. I don't know if she remembers that. Councillor Winter will be a great loss to Derby City Council and its residents, and I would like to thank her for all the hard work she has done and wish her very well. Okay. I'd like to move on to Councillor Lorraine Radford now. I'll keep it short. Councillor Radford and I have supported and encouraged each other through the trials and tribulations of being a councillor. We've worked very closely together as our wards overlap, sharing common issues. We have also been on the same commissions. I've never known anyone to read all her paperwork so thoroughly before any meeting. Maybe Councillor Troop, but that's all. Personally, I shall be lost without Lorraine because we often share our journeys, and that's when we manage to catch up on council issues. Our very first council event, which I shall always remember, was the Muslim Women's Party in Normanton 4 years ago. This is also an opportunity to warn fellow councillors about a problem with Councillor Radford. Don't bother buying any raffle tickets if she does, because you'll never get the prize. Lorraine always wins. I would like to wish Councillor Radford all the very best. It's very sad to see another woman councillor leaving. Thank you for all your hard work. You will be missed. Okay.
Thank you. I have a further procedural announcement. When we debate the council... Sorry. Oh, sorry. Councillor Jackson.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor. I would like to thank very much Councillor Faye Winter for all the help that she's given to us and all the support on the licensing committee. But always rely on her common sense. The things she said were always sensible to the point, and we always had a good outcome. Well, nearly always had a good outcome. She's quite fearless sometimes. I echo everything that's been said by Sadia. I think you will be a loss to the council, Faye, and I think you will be a loss to the people of Mickletover. And I hope they appreciate, and I'm sure they do, what you've done for them. I hope you have a very happy retirement and we still see something of you.
Thank you, Councillor Jackson. When we debate the Council Cabinet meeting minutes at item 10 on the agenda, new legislation requires us to take a recorded vote, regardless of our normal constitutional rules, on the setting of council tax for 2014-15. For that reason, we have a report at item 9 with recommendations to alter our council procedure rule 71. And finally, it is with much sadness that I tell you that less than an hour ago I was informed of the death after a long illness of Pamela Ahern, who was mayoress of Derby in 2006-07. Pamela was affected by myasthenia gravis throughout her term, but showed great strength and courage by supporting her husband John as mayor. I will be writing to express condolences of the council to Pamela's family. Can I ask that we stand now to observe a 1 minute silence? Please be seated. We move on to item 5, statement from members of the Council Cabinet. We have a statement on 2 issues from leaders of the Council. Paul Bayliss.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and can I thank Council and those people across the piece who've actually said thank you on my wedding to Paula. And just a word of warning for those who know her, don't call her Mrs Bayliss. But anyway, thank you for that. In terms of the statement, in the last 12 months, this Labour-led council has made a tangible difference to the lives of Derby residents. Derby City Council is creating jobs, delivering improved standards in education and sheltering residents from the worst effects of the government cuts. In terms of economy investment, the Derby Enterprise Growth Fund has allowed more than 50 companies to benefit from £12 million of grants, creating 900 jobs as a matter of fact and securing thousands more. To draw on one of many successes, the DEGF has made a £4 million investment in EPM technology. The firm manufactures carbon fibre components for Formula One cars, and the funding has allowed EPM to expand their facilities and their workforce. This medium-sized company is benefiting from Derby's prowess in high-tech engineering. Investment in capital projects is creating the infrastructure to continued and sustained growth. This Labour administration, working with its partners, has secured £12 million worth of funding for improvements to the A52 approaching the city centre, ensuring traffic moves freely, reducing journey times and providing a welcome boost to the economy. We have recently announced a £5 million redevelopment of Duckworth Square, unveiled plans for the global technology campus called Infinity Park that would create over 2,000 jobs, begun the long-awaited refurbishment of the former Magistrates' Court to be called Riverside View, and the construction of the Cathedral Quarter Enterprise Centre. The first homes in Castlewood Urban Village are nearing completion, and planning permission has been secured for the Nightingale Quarter on the site of the former Derby Royal Infirmary for further city centre housing development. In the coming year, we will be celebrating the opening of Derby Arena, and due course a sponsor will be announced to support this project that will be delivering on time and on budget at the end of 2014. This important development seeks to capitalise on a sector, the leisure market, worth in excess of £3 billion to the UK economy, and will establish our city as a regional hub for cycling. Through careful, targeted investment, this Labour administration is cementing Derby's position as a centre of excellence in high-tech transport engineering. Moreover, we are creating and safeguarding jobs while regenerating key areas of the city, and we are proud of Derby and everything it has to offer. In terms of education, we must ensure that our young people are well equipped to fill the jobs we are creating, and that begins with education. We're improving standards across the city. Unlike previous administrations, we are not content to see Derby languish at the foot of the Ofsted tables. Since this Labour administration took office, we've seen a remarkable upturn in the performance of Derby schools. It is testament to the hard work of teachers, governors and officers led by this council that 72% of our schools have been rated either good or outstanding by Ofsted, compared with just 50% in June 2012. Despite the erroneous comments of Michael Gove in the House of Commons and the disastrous failure of the Al Medina Free School, Derby's children and young people are doing better under this administration, and we will strive to make further improvements and tough decisions that may entail. In terms of campaigns, we are fighting for Derby and its residents at the time when nobody else will. We are tackling the cost of living crisis and implementing policies to ensure the burden on working families, to ease the burden on working families. We are incredibly proud to note that from April 2014, all council employees will receive a living wage of £7.45 per hour, resulting in a pay rise for approximately 1,000 council employees. We are supporting those affected by the bedroom tax by providing budgeting and benefit advice, helping tenants to downsize, arranging mutual house swaps and making funds available to meet the costs involved in moving home. And I want to make it clear that this Labour administration is opposed to the bedroom tax and would seek to have it abolished. Ready to Switch campaign energy auctions have provided hugely successful. In the first round of the scheme between April and July 2013, 195 people secured savings on their energy bills of up to £412 per year, something that we will continue to do. Together with our partners, we have fought tirelessly to stand behind Bombardier to secure the Crossrail contract. I'd like to applaud the efforts of all involved, including council from across this chamber, in supporting the 1,500 workers at Lidchurch Lane. I'm sure we'll talk more about this later. Finally, we would continue to fight for a fair deal for Derby, to oppose the unequal distribution of cuts to local authority funding. While the government is intransigent on the plight of the vulnerable, we will not allow the most deprived to suffer in silence. Awards. Our hard work has not gone unnoticed, and I'm delighted to report that Derby City Council, under Labour leadership, has been recognised by numerous awards in the past 12 months. In 2013, we won the LGC Management Team of the Year and Business Transformation Awards, while our Children's Services and Partnership Working took MJ Awards in their respective categories. We've also been nominated for this prestigious LGC Council of the Year award both in 2013 and 2014. In fact, within the month we will discover whether we are a runner-up or a winner. In addition, in the past year, Derby City Council has been awarded a purple flag recognising the diversity and safety of our city's nightlife, and a green flag for the quality of Derby's parks and green spaces. We judge our performance by how we fulfil the needs of our residents, but it's always satisfying to be recognised by our peers as well. Proud of Derby. In the coming years, local government faces an unprecedented challenge. We must deliver the services our residents expect and deserve on a budget that will reduce by 43% between 2009 and 2016. Nevertheless, this administration is rising to the challenge. We are proud of Derby and everything it has to offer and everything we've achieved. I encourage people to support the Proud of Derby campaign and see most councillors have picked up and wearing the badge this evening. This Labour-led administration will stand up to the government for its residents. It will stand up and be proud of its manufacturing heritage in planes, trains and automobiles, and next week we'll stand proud on a world stage at MIPIM, selling Derby to the world. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Hickson, do you wish to respond?
Well, very briefly, Mr. Mayor, just to thank the Leader of the Council for highlighting the generosity of the coalition government in giving all these grants to Derby City to enable them to achieve these things. Because in paragraph 3, the Derby Enterprise Growth Fund made the £4 million investment, nothing to do with this council. The Global Technology Campus was part of the Regional Growth Fund funding that I achieved when I was Leader of the Council. Again, nothing to do with this Labour Council. And the arena at Pride Park, which was a Conservative Lib Dem project that they weren't even sure they wanted to do when they took control of the council. They were in a panic when I passed over the decision to them after the election at which they won control. He didn't mention the rebuilding of Lees Brook School in Chaddesden, another success for the coalition government in terms of awarding funding. And although 72% of our schools have been rated either good or outstanding, more than a quarter, 28%, are not. And I think that is a real indictment of education in this city. 28% are not rated either good or outstanding. I do, however, though, commend officers in terms of the awards that they've won. They've won them despite the fact that there's a Labour administration in place, rather than because of it. And I do commend the officers who have to work under particularly trying circumstances at the moment. So it's a wonder that they've managed to achieve any awards at all, bearing in mind the terrible administration that they have to work for. In terms of the Proud of Derby final paragraph, I do agree that local government faces an unprecedented challenge. We have got substantial budgetary alterations to make over the next couple of years. I've not seen any evidence that this administration is rising to the challenge, and I go back to the budget speech I made to the Council in January. There is absolutely no indication of any intellectual rigour on behalf of the Labour group in dealing with the budgetary situation that we're in, and I remain yet to be convinced that they've got any grasp of the budget and its implications whatsoever.
Councillor Jones, do you wish to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of points. Following on from what Councillor Hickson's already said, I want to particularly thank the Secretary of State, Vince Cable, the Lib Dem Secretary of State, for listening to the lobbying that this council did, in particular when myself and the then leader went down to London, and having the vision to kind of trust us and give us this money, which you're now spending. And that's been great because it has created jobs. It's been a fantastic time, and we've got some more money to spend, more jobs to create, so that's great. And on behalf of this group, I want to particularly thank the teachers and staff, officers and governors for all their efforts in turning around those schools that weren't doing so well in their Ofsteds and are now performing excellently. Thank you.
We move on to item 6.
No, the leader's got another announcement.
Oh, right, sorry.
Yes, I've got another statement to make, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. This is about electoral cycles. Just to confirm, this Labour administration confirms its commitment to all-out elections once every 4 years. We believe they offer stability for our residents, our businesses and the future of our city. In a period of financial and economic uncertainty, residents and businesses deserve the consistency provided by all-out elections. When people cast their vote, they want assurances that a manifesto pledges will be delivered through to completion. The current system does not afford that guarantee. Since 2002 even, Derby City Council has had 6 different leaders with a myriad of combinations of political control. This has resulted in almost annual upset to work programmes and new administrations repeatedly having their hands tied by a budget that's not their own. Political groups are caught in a perpetual cycle of campaigning, devoting time and resources to elections rather than representing residents and delivering results for the city. In times of austerity, successive administrations have been perceived as deferring difficult decisions for fear of a political backlash. Such a short-sighted approach is no way to govern a city. All-out elections are more democratically engaging. When we compare Derby to our regional neighbours, who hold elections once every 4 years, the comparison is stark. In 2011, Nottingham and Leicester had voter turnout of 38% and 41%, respectively. In Derby, this figure was just 31%. I do not need to emphasise that increasing turnout affords a greater mandate to effect change. What is more, reform of the electoral system will put Derby City Council on a level playing field with our neighbours. We compete on a world stage, and while I have cited our near neighbours exemplars, we need to balance that with our real competitors are in Connecticut, Leipzig, Singapore and Seattle, and businesses are looking for certainty and commitment, something annual elections put in question. A single election every 4 years provides a stable footing required to guarantee local prosperity. 4-year terms offer a greater potential for capital investment, infrastructure programmes and job creation. When the economic recovery hangs in the balance, these are the engines of growth and something we have a duty to deliver for our proud city. Our partners, such as the Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire Chamber of Commerce, have been rightly critical of the regular changes of political control at Derby City Council. 4-year terms allow consistent policy making, which gives local, national and international businesses the security they need to thrive and council departments the direction to fill their roles more effectively. As unusually as it may sound, I'm forced to agree with a veteran member of the Conservative Party in his recent report on regional growth. Michael Heseltine was critical of election by thirds. To quote him, the cycles whereby a proportion of the leadership team change on an annual basis make anything but short-term decision-making difficult. This, in my view, is damaging for all forms of local authority services, but particularly for economic development. Those councils which hold one election every 4 years appear to be better placed to take strategic and longer-term decisions to the benefit of economic growth and without incurring the administrative costs associated with running annual election campaigns and managing change. As others know who have gone before me, as the leader of the council know, when you turn up to your first regional and national meetings with civil servants and other partners, you have to establish a working relationship as a safe pair of hands capable of delivering partnership and government agendas, no matter the colour of the government. The constant turnover of leaders makes developing that working relationship, which is so crucial to attracting investment for this city, far more challenging than it needs to be, especially when you compare Derby to Leicester and Nottingham. A switch to all-out elections would also save the Council £350,000 over a 4-year period and must surely be considered, particularly in these austere times. This saving is the gift of all councillors, not just the Labour group. The arguments levelled against all-out elections seem largely based on inconvenience they pose to political groups. It's been said in the past that fielding 51 candidates at a time is a too great a challenge, that all-out elections may result in large numbers of inexperienced councillors, or that 4 years in opposition would damage morale. We have a contribution to the Mayor's charity there, do we? As we councillors should put our service before self, this is something that we can do and is something I believe we should do. We should not deny Derby the economic success and stability it needs because it would be difficult for the Liberal Democrats to find 51 candidates, a frankly ridiculous argument. In these times of financial pressure, should we not reduce this costly indulgence by elections by thirds and what could be considered as unnecessary expenditure of £350,000 over 4 years? The Labour Group think we should. It's clear to me that we should put service to the city before party or self. It is in these principles we hold dear, or we are failing our duty to the city. I believe that Derby Labour Party has the foresight, talent, commitment, dynamism and strength as a group to take this lead, which is why I make this statement today. I know we have the best candidates, the most fervent campaigners, the most dedicated supporters. We are ready to compete at the ballot box and we are ready to take Derby forward 4 years at a time. I challenge the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats to prove me wrong and support a change to all-out elections. There are many councillors across the chamber who I know believe that it's the right thing to do. I repeat, it's what is best for our residents, best for our businesses and best for Derby. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Hickson.
Yes, Mr Mayor. I mean, there are arguments for and against both electoral systems, and although Councillor Bayliss may wish it, he can't impose it, such a change. And sometimes, you know, you need to be careful what you wish for in this life, and certainly in terms of altering political arrangements. As far as my group are concerned, they will listen and decide in due course, having listened to the arguments about what their views on a change to the electoral arrangements may be. But there has to be a requisite majority, I think it's 2/3, isn't it, in this chamber to effect such a change. At the moment, I don't see that being achieved, but maybe I'm wrong.
Councillor Jones.
Thank you. If the leader in this administration is so committed to elections by every 4 years, why just a statement? Why not put a motion down so that we can all debate it? That way you'd find out the opinions of everybody, including the backbenchers across this council. Instead, we just have a statement. And I just want to correct one thing. The Liberal Democrats are not afraid of finding 51 candidates. We found them last time we had all-out elections. And I'd like to remind you that we won enough seats to hold the balance of power and go on to take control of the council with the Conservatives. So, yes, you need to be careful what you wish for. I believe, personally, that annual elections are more democratic. It gives people the opportunity to go to the ballot box for 3 years out of 4. Perhaps you're afraid of that. And secondly, I don't think we should be putting any sort of price on democracy. We are very privileged in this country to be able to vote and to be able to do that on a regular basis. And I don't think we should put a price on that at all. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Higginbotham.
Mr Mayor, thank you very much. I welcome the statement from the Leader of the Council and I'm glad to see that you've come round to my way of thinking and you're supporting for Derby.
Okay, now we move on to item 6. Questions to the Cabinet members from the members of the public. We have 7 questions from 4 questioners, and I extend a warm welcome to all of you. The questions submitted and answers to them have been circulated in advance, and there is now an opportunity for a supplementary question on each one. I must remind questioners that the supplementary must be directly related to the initial question and the answer received. The first supplementary question is, the opportunity is given to Ms. Skritek, but I can't see her here. So I go on to Mr. Falk. And the question is to Councillor Russell, but who's not here, and I gather Councillor Bayliss is going to answer that.
Right, thank you. If the decision was wrong, why did the monitor officer recently decided that the complaint that was made should not be investigated by the Standards Committee as laid down in the Council procedures? Was the monitoring officer lent on politically?
You really don't understand the question you just asked, do you? It shows your immaturity. But the answer to your question is that, as you well know, the issue in hand here has been referred to the Ombudsman and been dismissed as basically a politically motivated attack. But since I am the person that's answering the question, and I was the person that asked for this piece of advice, I can confirm I asked an officer whether it was permissible. That officer said it was. I took that advice. Latterly, we realised that maybe it shouldn't have been. A mistake was made. Answer the question. But I just wonder sometimes where UKIP come from. And it's nice to meet you tonight, because I know you read a lot about me. But you know, some of the things you do say, like opposed to HS2. Do you realise that 5,800 people in the city are employed in rail industries? Not a clue, have you? No, I can see that. So you don't want to hear.
Yeah, Councillor Hickenbottom, you don't decide that. Carry on.
Well, if any insult was offended there, may I apologise, Mr Mayor. It's not my intention to do that. I just want to point out that when you have questions that are politically vexatious, then I respond in a politically vexatious manner, maybe, and maybe I shouldn't have done in terms of a member of the public who I know is naive to these procedures. So, my apology, Mr Mayor.
Mr Wright, do you have a supplementary question?
Perhaps he may have another go at me then. I'm a UKIP member. Is there any link between you awarding this money to JET, the fact that you cut the core funding to JET, Employment Agency, in the last budget, and the Chief Executive is a Labour Party member?
Councillor Banway.
Thank you, Mr Wright. In terms of the premise of your question, which is the allocation of this funding, is this money well spent, especially at a time of government cuts? Well, can I start by the point that was being made, and just to reinforce that point, we are facing the worst government cuts in the history of our city, and that's the reality. We have to find £81 million worth of savings. So, in some ways, I agree with the premise that we've got to make every penny of taxpayers' money worth it. But in terms of actually the funding towards JET, I mean, can I just make it clear that our aim, and I hope we agree on this, should always be to make sure that every person in our city contributes to our culture, our way of life, in making Derby a better place to live. In terms of who comes here, of course, into our city, especially from outside of the country, is whether we like it or not, is not just down to us. These are national issues. It is determined by central government. Clearly, we do have some say down the ballot box, and we'll have that opportunity, no doubt, in due course. But hopefully you'll also agree with me that when people are here, irrespective of where they come from, that we should do what we can to make them feel welcome, to provide them whatever care we can for them if they need that, but also, most importantly, and hopefully we agree on this point, that we should give them the skills to work for themselves, to be able to put food on the table for their families, and to contribute to our city and make Derby our home. And in terms of Derby, the success of that approach, I like to think I'm an evidence of that. I'm an immigrant son. If you look across the council chamber, there are many of us. That's where ultimately we want to get to. Derby is a better place for it. And just as my parents' generation, when they came over, there was obviously a bit of anxiety, no doubt. And I can remember walking up and down Normanton Road when it looked very, very different to what it is today. And I'm sure when people looked at my mum in a sari, you know, talking Punjabi, that it was very much a bit alien to a lot of the people there. But one thing I'm convinced of is the British character. The British character is welcoming. You know, Britain is a very, very diverse country. And just as they made my parents feel very, very welcome, I hope, and really, and I'm not a particularly religious person, but I hope you don't take offence when I say pray, that actually as a faith person that believes in faith, and as a socialist, that we will actually extend our warm welcome to these people. We've got to bear in mind that, you know, the funding that is going to JET is accessed by everybody. Absolutely. You know, I've spoken to Mohammed Sharif today, the Chief Executive, and I expressed your concerns to him because they are legitimate. You know, the concerns are shared by many people in Derby. And he is prepared, he's more than welcome for you to go along, and I'm prepared, I'll give you his number, to go along, speak to Mohammed in person, have a look around what they do, to give you all the facts really, to make you, to give you the information that you need to broaden your perspective on the issue, because I'm not sure if you had a chance to go down there. But Mr Mayor, can I just also say, you know...
You answered the question. So
no, sorry, Mr Mayor, if I can just say, can I also say that this is no reflection on the terminology that you used. It's a terminology being used by the media, by a lot of people. And this thing about East Europeans, you know, let's not forget, you know, the migrating communities here, especially the Poles. You know, let's not forget, I'm a historian, so I look at things in a historical perspective. Don't forget, we found it acceptable and encouraged people from Poland in the 40s that couldn't speak a word of English to get into a Spitfire, which was a very expensive piece of machinery at the time, to get in the skies and to fight for our country. And a lot of them died for our country. And the highest scoring pilots in the Battle of Britain, and that's a fact, were Polish pilots. And it was a Polish squadron that fought for this country. So that is the type of contribution that I'm sure you and I want to see made in this country. So in terms of the funding for JET, I will work extremely hard to make sure every penny is well spent. And if one day, stood where I am, is a child of a father or a mother that somebody's benefited from that funding, stood here in this council chamber, I think that would be every penny worth spent. Thank you.
Mr. Hassel, do you have a supplementary? Good. Mr. Bacon, do you have a supplementary question to Councillor Banwit?
Mr. Mayor, I'm hoping it's not answers on a postcard like last time. Through these figures, we've identified that brown bin collections cost the city, to be fair, circa £20 per bin in 2012-13. Freedom of Information documents provided to me show that the Council proposed a £20 charge, noting how competitive the price was compared to other local councils. Why then did the Council suddenly ignore itself and double the cost to £40?
Councillor Banwit?
Yes, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Mr Bacon, for your question. I'll be providing you an answer to your supplementary question in writing. I've used all my time up to Mr Wright because it's the first time he's come, you see, and I felt he deserved that. Thank you.
Mr. Hassel, do you have a supplementary question to Councillor Afzal?
Will the Cabinet member agree to hold a public meeting for residents in the Chester Green, Little Chester area as a matter of urgency to both update them on Derby's flood defence scheme and to answer their questions? If so, can you confirm a date and venue to me in writing, please?
Councillor Afzal. Can you confirm the date and time of the meeting which has been suggested?
Can confirm with residents like Lisa Rodriguez, Jack Stanton, Martin Repton. They represent Darley Ward. We've had meetings and they are continuous meetings we are having. So you're more than welcome to attend those meetings, whether you attend them on behalf of Darley Ward or whether you're on behalf of UKIP Conservatives, up to you.
Mr. Bacon, your supplementary question to Councillor Banwit.
Unless you didn't ask me if I got one, you obviously know I already had. Councillor Banway, what amount in tonnes of the 10,030.73 tonnes of the household waste which was recovered, which includes being burnt for energy, and so below recycling in the waste hierarchy? How many tonnes?
Councillor Banway?
Thank you, Mr Bacon, for your question. I'll be providing you a written answer to your supplementary. Thank you.
We move on to item 7, questions about the business of Derbyshire Fire Authority and Derbyshire Homes. We have one question from Councillor Poulter. Councillor Bayliss is representing the Fire Authority. A written response has been published. Councillor Poulter, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes, I do, Mr Mayor, thank you. Councillor Bayliss, thank you for your answer, in which you actually concede that in deliberating the precept, the Treasurer of the authority actually pointed out to you the levels of reserves, both in revenue and capital, which, as you know, amount to millions of pounds. He also pointed out to you the projected budget surplus that this precept will create, and also you'll be aware that in 12-13 there were millions of pounds worth of underspend on the budget, which are also in reserves. In your answer you talk about, and you use the expression that this decision you've taken is proactive action. It's providing a sustainable, ongoing, cashable savings. Councillor Bayliss, does that really mean you're stockpiling reserves? I suggest you're stockpiling reserves to...
So you've asked the question, and I think let him answer that. You've asked the question.
The question is...
You've actually just asked the question.
No, the actual question is, the authority has enough money, it does not actually need to impose this increase on the public of Derby.
Okay. Councillor Bayliss.
The answer to the question is really very simple. In terms of the fire and rescue service, the government profiled their spending cuts in a different way. The previous authority took the view to try and stockpile reserves. The reason for that is very simple. Over an extended period of time, the cuts to the fire and rescue service budget will mean that it will need and spend, in fact, it will spend all that reserve money. Currently it is over-establishment. That means it's got more firefighters than the establishment currently requires. But there are on a retirement profile, and what we would want to avoid in all cases is to see us dismissing by redundancy loyal, hard-working firefighters in this county. It is also important to make sure that no matter where one is in terms of managing an authority, this authority, the City Council or the Fire Authority, that we have as much of the control of finances under our own control as putting these in the hands or leaving these in the hands of government is sort of a wishful moment of a pen being wafted and finding that we haven't got the money we thought we had. Those people who have been involved in budgeting in the public sector will know that what you have this year you may not have next year, and a certain amount of investigation and digging has to be undertaken by office to ensure that budget settlements are what they're promised, because we found in this council that there's a difference, and the same happens in the Fire and Rescue Authority. So I think that shows that we've been prudent. We've made sure that the control of the budget is as far as possible in the hands of people in Derbyshire, and we manage the service in a proper and proactive way. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Bayliss. We move on to item 8 to receive questions from non-council cabinet members. We have 6 questions from 3 questioners, Councillors Ashburn, Skelton and Holmes. As previously, the questions submitted and answers to them have been circulated in advance, and there is now an opportunity for a supplementary question on each one. I again remind questioners that the supplementary must be directly related to the initial question and the answer received. Councillor Ashburn, your supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. What does the Labour Group intend to do to reduce the number of Derby City Council zero-hour contracts from the current 1,200, especially given the objections expressed by Labour's comrades in the Socialist Workers' Party in Derby last Saturday? Thank you.
Councillor Bayliss.
Well, I can't speak for the Socialist Workers' Party, and nor would I wish to. But I think we reflect, we certainly have reflected. Sarah Russell, the Cabinet Member responsible, who's ill tonight, so her apology for not being here, has been working very hard to reduce the number of zero-hours contracts as far as is possible and practical to do so. But we have to balance 2 things in mind when we're doing that. Firstly, there are, believe it or not, a number of people who actually like zero-hours contracts. It fits what they do, their work style, their lifestyle, and that's what they want to do. Got another contribution to the Mayor's charity, another £10. That's £20 this evening, Mr Mayor. And the other point is that there's the need to manage the services of this council efficiently. And because the service demands on this council are not necessarily linear throughout the year, sometimes having 0 hours contracts in the current form is something that works for the service delivery and the betterment of this city. However, as an administration, as a principle, we're wedded to the fact that people should not have 0 hours contracts. But having said that, we are having to manage this budget at times where we've got 43% cuts in our budget coming our way, and we need to be flexible. So our wish would be to have none, but there are two factors we need to bear in mind. One is that people sometimes choose to work 0 hours contract, and secondly, for the delivery of services to people in the city, we need to have them. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Skelton, do you have a supplementary question to Councillor Afzal?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. With regard to housing being built on public open space, I'm told that developers have already been in discussions with the council and even planning applications have been made in some cases for building on land that's designated as public open space. Can you confirm this, please?
Councillor Afzal.
Good evening, Councillor Skelton. As far as I'm aware, our green space is open to consultation and it's still an ongoing process, and this Cabinet and this Council have not made any decision like that at the moment. Thank you.
Councillor Holmes, do you have a supplementary question to Councillor Afzal?
I do, thank you, Mr. Mayor. In September 2008, under the previous government, £25 million of funding was announced to protect around 3,600 homes in Derby from flooding. With the current government putting forward £36 million, an increase of £11 million, will you, as the Cabinet member responsible, agree to write to Labour MP for Derby North, Chris Williamson, to ensure he understands that his recent statement that Derby's flood defence funding has been cut is wrong, and therefore, his comments should be seen as politically motivated scaremongering by his constituents who are elected to inform, he is elected to inform and represent rather than to mislead?
I don't think the official figures that Chris Williamson has actually used, Councillor Holmes, he has not misled anybody. Those were the figures, and if you take into account inflation...
Not true.
I'm not picking anything up off the floor, pick it up yourself. Not true, you're just going along. I've looked at your figures.
Councillor Ashburn, do you have a supplementary question to Councillor Bayliss?
Yes, thank you. How can Labour support employing so many consultants when they are making people redundant? Thank you.
Councillor Bayliss.
The issue of in consultants is one that we seek to minimise. There are specialist cases when any administration has been in office, whether it be Liberal Democrat or Conservative, that you have to employ people with specialist knowledge. We have sought to minimise that, and in fact have a good history of doing that, and we use consultants when it's appropriate and when it's necessary for the efficient administration of this city. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Skelton, do you have a supplementary question to Councillor Repton?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Holmes, do you have a supplementary question to Councillor Afzal? Councillor Holmes? Okay, we move on to item 9. Amendments to Council Procedure Rules concerning recorded votes. Paul?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Could I formally move it as printed, a change to our constitution, which will then affect the need to take a recorded vote at the appropriate point in the agenda under council tax, Mr. Mayor?
Is that agreed? Those for the motion? Any against? Item 10, minutes of the meeting of the Council Cabinet requiring approval of the Council. We have two items in addition to Council tax. They are 164/13, Osmaston Vision. Does anyone wish to speak?
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Turner?
Mr. Mayor, I do. Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I am very pleased that this recommendation has come to Council. It has taken a long time for this development to be on the point of agreement, and that is despite negativity expressed
by two now former leaders of this council. Firstly, we had one of the then leaders saying that there was no money for the regeneration and we should therefore scrap it. Then another then leader said that wards like Sinfin waste the resources put into them. But we had the solidarity of the people of the Oscar Group in Osmaston, which defeated negativity. I thank them. I welcome the opportunity for this council to refute negativity and give approval.
Can I have a mover and a seconder for the motion? Oh, sorry, Councillor Jones.
I only wish to clarify that while I was leader of the council, the Osmaston division was started under our administration, and it's something that I do support because I think that sort of community initiative is fantastic. So it wasn't me.
Okay.
Mr Mayor, could I therefore move under item 10 the first motion to approve the above minutes and recommendations of the Council Cabinet of the 12th of February?
Those in favour of the motion? Any against? We move on to 165/13, Joint Committee for Economic Prosperity. Does anyone wish to speak on this item?
Could I move the motion as printed, Mr Mayor?
Those for the motion? Any against? We move now to minute 170/13, Council Tax 2014-15. And it is on this item that we must take a recorded vote. Document 10A, circulated as part of the agenda, gives us the full details of the recommendations, including the precepts set by Police and Crime Commissioner and Derbyshire Fire Authority. Figures received since the Cabinet meeting. Leader, do you wish to speak?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I want to formally move the recommendations of 170/13, and as you've already done it, but just to confirm, we do need to have a recorded vote now under the new standing order CP71B. We've also had, as you've indicated, Mr Mayor, the full details of settlement. I can confirm that the budget situation has not changed materially from the last meeting. We've also had the police 1.96% and fire 1.91% council tax increase included in this report before us tonight. This report reflects the budget we set on the 29th of January and the impact the government's swingeing cuts to the council's budget. Its failure to allow for budget inflation and increased demand for services from the fact we should celebrate things like people living longer in this city and younger people with serious conditions who are living into adulthood. And also they've placed additional burdens on us from government which they haven't funded. And generally this reflects the unfairness to Derby in terms of the government funding formula, which is why the fair deal for Derby is so important. Even if we set council tax tonight, we will still be levying one of the lowest council tax rates in the East Midlands, the second lowest of the 43 authorities in the East Midlands, we believe, and one of the 20th lowest in England. And one of the interesting facts that we've yet to publish but we'll be doing shortly is one of the latest surveys shows that over 50% of our residents agree that the council provide value for money in terms of service delivery. We are one of the most efficient councils in the land, and yet again, next week in fact, we're up for an award of the Council of the Year, which I'm very proud of. It shows that we are judged by our peers as a well-performing authority. I'd like to formally move the motion, Mr Mayor, because we've had the budget debate at the previous meeting.
Councillor Jones wishes to say something. Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a couple of 2 or 3 points that I wanted to bring out because we have had most of this debate before. I didn't want the residents of Derby to forget that this administration has chosen not to accept the freeze grant and has decided to put up the council tax. They've chosen to do this again this year, having done it last year. I've seen figures that over the average life of this Parliament, that where the council tax freeze has been taken each year, it has saved residents about £1,000. Instead, this Labour-led council have chosen not to help you, the residents of Derby, but they are increasing the council tax, which certainly won't help. In recent years, local Liberal Democrats have predicted that the council tax would rise under Labour, because we know that it's your philosophy as the Labour group to tax and spend. It impacts on residents and it impacts on businesses. It's probably no coincidence that up and down this land, Labour-controlled councils are putting up council taxes. We've seen that elsewhere locally. They then complain that it's all the government's fault. You've heard this for the last 18 months. What you don't hear is the Labour Party owning up to the national debt and the mess they left us in after 12 years of administration. Well, exactly. We've been busy paying it off, haven't we, for you? They borrowed more than they could afford. And we have, as a government, been paying that debt off, and we have cut that back by a third to date. The economy, under the careful financial management of the coalition, has grown in the last 12 months by 1.9%. That's the best growth since 2007. It's national government policy bearing fruit. Nationally, there's more good news. Hard-pressed families and businesses under the coalition government have seen fuel duties frozen. So each time you fill up your tank, on average, you're probably £7 better off. The state pension has risen by its biggest ever cash increase. By April the 24th, 24 million people will not pay tax on the first £10,000 of earnings, so £700 per person going back into their pockets. 1.5 million new apprenticeships created since the last general election. 1 million new private sector jobs with more people in work than any time in our history. Interest rates kept low. Inflation falling. £50 a year on average to be cut from energy bills. So we see Liberal Democrats and their coalition partners delivering good news. Compare that with Derby and Labour, where this evening they are delivering bad news. Here in Derby, the Lib Dems would have saved you money, just as we did when we were in administration and as we're doing nationally. We would have taken the council tax freeze grant from the government and frozen your council tax. Under us, your bill would not have risen last year or this year. This council tax rise is causing suffering, and that's to people all across the region that are paying out. And I and the Liberal Democrats cannot support this council tax rise, and we will be voting against it.
Okay, we will now move to a recorded vote.
Would members please indicate when I call out their name if they wish to vote for or against the Cabinet Minute 17013 recommendations? Councillor Afzal. For. Councillor Allen.
Against.
Councillor Ashburner.
Against.
Councillor Atwall.
Against.
Councillor Bailey.
Against.
Councillor Banwaite. Councillor Barker.
Against.
Councillor Bayliss.
For.
Councillor Bolton. Councillor Campbell.
For.
Councillor Carr. Councillor Davis. Councillor Dinser.
For, and can I record, Mr Mayor, that I am a member of the Derbyshire Police and Crime Commissioner's Office.
Councillor Harwood.
Against.
Councillor Hickson.
Against.
Councillor Higginbottom. Councillor Hillier. Councillor Holmes.
Against.
Councillor Ingle.
Against.
Councillor Jackson. Councillor Jennings. Not here. Councillor Jones.
Against.
Councillor Keith. Councillor Jangir Khan. Councillor Shiraz Khan. Councillor MacDonald. Councillor Martin. Councillor Nater.
Against another tax increase.
Councillor Nawaz. Councillor Pegg. Councillor Poulter. Councillor Radford. Councillor Rawson.
For.
Councillor Redfern. Councillor Repton. Councillor Roberts. Councillor Sandhu, not present. Councillor Shanker. Councillor Skelton. Councillor Stanton. Councillor Titley.
For.
Councillor Troop. Councillor Turner.
For.
Councillor Webb. Councillor Whitby. Councillor Fay Winter. Councillor Linda Winter. Councillor Wood. Councillor Hussain the Mayor.
For.
For 26, against 20.
That's carried. We move on to item 11, recommendations of the Independent Remuneration Panel Members Allowances Scheme 2014-15. Does anyone wish to speak? Councillor Bayliss.
Yeah. In terms of the panel's work, could I first pay tribute to the panel's hard work? They've worked very hard over the years, and over a number of years we've deliberated and largely, let's be honest, not taken up their recommendations. However, I'm delighted tonight to say that in terms of what's recommended here, that we're only proposing one change. There has been some debate across party. I'm proposing to move an amendment, and Councillor Hickson indicated he would second it, regarding one change. And while people just hand this out, the one change is to retain broadband for existing members, should they wish to continue with it, essentially. Because I think it's important that those members who haven't got their own personal broadband are enabled to continue with the service they've had for a number of years. Thank you, Mr Mayor. If you want to just pause on that point.
Do we have a seconder for the amendment? Okay. Do you wish to speak? Okay. Those in favour of the amendment? Any against? That's carried. Item 12, the pay policy statement.
No, you
Does
need
anyone?
to vote on the amended motion.
Oh, sorry.
We've voted on the amendment, so now we need to vote on the amendment as amended.
Could I formally, Mr Mayor, if it helps, move the motion as amended, for item 11 and formally put that to the vote?
Can we take a vote on the motion as amended? Those in favour? Any against? That's carried. Item 12, the pay policy statement. Does anyone wish to speak on this item? If not, we move to vote. Those in favour?
Can I move as printed, Mr Mayor?
Any against? Item 13, notices of motion. We have 4 items for debate. The first one is proposed by Councillor Hickson and seconded by Councillor Holmes. Councillor Hickson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. First of all, can I just explain to members who may be wondering why I brought a motion like this to Council? There are occasions when social issues arise on which we as decision makers and policy formers need to take a stand, and I think this is one of them. And let me make clear at the outset, absolutely crystal clear, that there is no criticism implied in this motion or otherwise of our officers or systems within this Council. But of course we can never be complacent about such a serious issue as domestic violence. So what is it about domestic violence that is so important as an issue to this Council? Well, according to police assessments, more than 10,000 women and children are at high risk of being murdered or seriously injured by current or former partners. And this is likely to be an underestimate, as domestic violence is badly underreported, with a victim often suffering many attacks before they come forward. And I think at the last count it was something like an average of 34 instances before a victim came forward to make a report to the authorities. There are also too many mistakes being made by police when dealing with high-risk victims, which leave them vulnerable to attack or being killed, and also leave perpetrators at large. Last year, the Derby coroner found that police failures contributed to the death of Rachel Slack and her 2-year-old son. They were both stabbed to death. She'd been assessed as high risk by the police, but the police never told her. So there are big questions that we need to have answered about how risk affecting domestic violence is managed by this Council, how records are kept, and how potential victims might be better informed and protected. And there is no doubt, Councillors, that the situation regarding domestic violence is getting worse. National figures show 2 women a week are killed. 1 in 5 of all 999 calls relates to domestic violence. We see families being driven from their homes and lives destroyed by fear. And I have to say to you that if there was this much violence at football matches, I can imagine that there'd be government task forces, new laws, newspaper campaigns. But on this issue, very little is said. And often in these crimes, these insidious crimes, there are no witnesses. And often the only witnesses are the person being attacked and her or his attacker, and children who may be witnesses to what's going on. And the impact of domestic violence and domestic abuse is immense. And this council, along with every other unitary authority, has a big and significant role in dealing with cases. And it also has to be a matter of concern to us as elected members that both prosecutions and convictions have also fallen significantly. Despite more domestic abuse being reported to the police, 13% fewer cases are being sent for prosecution. And that means that there's been a significant drop in convictions as a result. And bluntly, that means fewer criminals stopped and more potential victims at risk. And I feel that as members, we need to make sure that we have strong leadership in this area and that we have very clear standards and protocols in place for dealing with domestic violence. Because the recent figures tell us that 1 woman in 4 and 1 man in 6 in the UK will be a victim of domestic violence in their lifetime. And I find that a staggering figure, and one that we can't easily ignore as policymakers and decision makers within this council. And I know that traditionally many still consider domestic violence as a crime committed on women by men, but men can also be victims. And for those of you who watch soaps like I do, you'll have seen that particular line explored in Coronation Street, where a male victim was the subject of domestic violence by a woman. And it's no less significant and no more easy when those roles are reversed. And also, we have to consider domestic violence within same-sex relationships, where it's also a significant issue. So what is domestic violence? What are we talking about here? Domestic violence is officially classified as any incident of threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between adults who are or have been in a relationship together, or between family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. And I would guess, or I'd hazard a guess, that most of us think of domestic violence as hitting or slapping or beating. But more often than not, it also includes emotional abuse, as well as things like forced marriage and so-called honour crimes. It's abuse if a partner or family member threatens the other person, makes them fear for their physical safety, puts them down or attempts to undermine their self-esteem, controls them, for example, by stopping them seeing friends and family, are jealous and possessive, such as being suspicious of friends and conversations, and if they frighten the other party. And I'm particularly saddened that there are still, mainly men in our society, who hold partners, and especially women, in contempt in this area. And it's often never too long before some example of sexist behaviour turns up, or someone makes a joke out of what is a very serious crime. Indeed, we had a very recent example in this chamber when the Deputy Leader of the Council used domestic violence as a joke to make a political point. But domestic violence is no laughing matter, and certainly not to the victim. But it indicates a more serious attitude, and I think it's one that many people share. In a recent case that was reported to West Midlands Police, 2 police officers are alleged to have accidentally left a message on the voicemail of a suspect teenage victim of domestic violence. And on that message, they referred to her as a bitch and a slag. Now, I ask you, is it impossible that such a case could not happen in this city? I'm not sure. In that case, the victim said that she was shell-shocked. She said it was horrifying. She said she felt sick and upset. She said it was like being assaulted all over again. But these words will be all too familiar to female victims of male violence, who again and again describe the process of dealing with the police, social workers and the court system as worse than the original ordeal. I was amazed that the victim in that particular example that I've just told you about actually went to the police station under her own steam and made a statement after hearing what she did on her voicemail. How many women would have done that? And what if that had been a rape case? And domestic violence victims often consider themselves as somehow to blame for what has happened to them. And their abusers often tell them and reinforce the myth that it's their fault that this has happened to them. And I just want to make one final point about vocabulary before I move on. And this isn't about political correctness, and those people who know me know that I won't have any truck with political correctness. But how many people in this chamber have heard the word slag and heard it used in a context where it's being used as a term of abuse, often against women who dare to challenge perceived male authority? How many of us in this chamber, if we had heard it, would have challenged it? The Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, warns of new forms of victim blaming following the Savile disclosures and revelations. And it's interesting, isn't it, how when these cases are dismissed, the press and others often roundly turn on the accuser, who is then condemned as a liar or an instigator. And I have to say to you that in the cases that I've dealt with as a counsellor, the justice system, and that's a system created by men largely to deal with the criminality of other men, still often systematically fails women in its processes, as does the police, local authorities and other agencies. So, that leads me on to the recommendations within this motion. What can this council do, and why should we do anything? I hope that by listening to what I've said earlier on, I've convinced you that we should do something. This motion, I believe, sets out something that we can do. We can, as a council, make it absolutely clear where we stand on the issue of domestic violence. We can, as a council, give victims confidence to come to us for help. And we can, as members, make sure that our professional practice is the best it can be, and that we regularly make sure that it is. And we also, as councillors, need to make sure that we are empowered to understand the issues involved and to deal with domestic violence when we see it and when it's presented to us in our role as elected representatives. And that's why this motion makes the recommendations that it does. That's why I call on the Council this evening to take a positive stand on this issue, to say that Derby will be an exemplar of good practice, that we will give the issue of domestic violence the seriousness that it deserves, and that we will put forward and implement the very measured proposals that I've set out in the motion at paragraphs A to E. And I commend this motion to Council.
Mr Mayor, I formally second the motion and reserve my right to speak.
Okay. Councillor Dinson.
Mr Mayor, I've submitted an amendment to this resolution.
Mr Mayor, I second the amendment. Thank you.
If you could read it out, yeah.
Mr Mayor, if the amendment is approved, the motion will read as follows. This Council is concerned about the levels of domestic abuse across the country, but most particularly within the City of Derby, where domestic abuse is a growing issue of concern and where the Council has a direct role in combating the issue. The levels of abuse are astonishing, with a recent survey showing that 30% of the female population has been subject to domestic abuse of one sort or another, and that this may be an underestimate, as victims are often reluctant to report this crime. Council wants to reaffirm its commitment to and good record in dealing with this insidious crime, and in the view of impending changes to commissioning of victim support services being passed to the Police and Crime Commissioner for Derbyshire, therefore ask the Council Cabinet to bring forward proposals to work in partnership with the Police and Crime Commissioner using the established cross-party Neighbourhoods Overview and Scrutiny Board to A. Consider and evaluate the levels of domestic abuse within the city, B. Dip sample the way that cases have been managed and their outcomes, C. Discuss and disseminate the best possible levels of professional practice within the city, D. Consider setting up a strategic county-wide group to enhance the work of domestic abuse specialists, such as the independent domestic violence advocates, E. Make recommendations to Cabinet about future resources, training and awareness. F. Urge Government to consider seriously the call by domestic abuse specialists that coercive control be made an offence. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Dinser.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, I think nobody in this chamber can argue against the view that domestic abuse and violence is something that we should all fight against and raise awareness as much as we can, and this resolution contributes to that process. However, I think the resolution can be enhanced and improved by the amendments that I've actually identified and put before you today. There is no doubt that the national survey quoted by Councillor Hickson clearly indicates there are increases and there's large numbers of the population, mostly women, but also, as Councillor Hickson mentioned, other sections or orientations who get victimised from domestic abuse. This amendment takes into account the most recent events, which is that the Police and Crime Commissioner for Derbyshire has got a new commissioning role in terms of commissioning victim support services for Derbyshire from 1st of October. Therefore, any addition to the strategic work that's already been done needs to take that into account. Secondly, a cross-party panel to be set up. I don't believe we need to have additional panels. We already have a cross-party scrutiny panel, the Neighbourhoods Board, which can actually take issues and debate them and make recommendations to the Cabinet and the Council as a whole. So I think that's a better, more effective way of achieving the same goals. The training issue about members, I think, is covered in paragraph E of the original amendment, which talks about making recommendations about future resources, training and awareness. I think that are equally important for members as they are for many other members of the City Council and relevant agencies regarding training and awareness. I have put in place an additional paragraph, which is paragraph F, which, if some of you have listened to Radio 4 this morning and the media, would have realised that many specialists in domestic abuse and violence have indicated that the issue of domestic abuse, which does not sort of have any boundaries of class, structure, race or affluence. Every corner of society is susceptible to abuse and being abused. So therefore, I think the specialists, particularly the women's organisation, have urged the government to consider a new crime of coercive control. And I think we should urge the government to seriously consider this as a way forward, because that better, in my view, encapsulates domestic abuse and violence. Because it, as Councillor Hickson said, it highlights the issue that domestic abuse is just not about violence and assaults. It is about controls such as what somebody wears, where they spend money, what money they have, and how they can conduct their behaviour. They are all issues that add up into the envelope of abuse. And I think this position by specialists in this field and urging the government to look at that as a possible way forward is something that we should, as a council, support and urge the council to, the government to consider in its future policy shaping and making. I do have to say, I mean, I've also added that some of the good work that already does happen. Of course, mistakes are made in many different agencies, but I think it's important to note that there is strong partnership working within Derbyshire already, across the City Council, the County Council, the police, probation services and other agencies. There is also a multi-agency approach to tackling domestic abuse. The MAREC process is one, which is specifically for domestic violence cases and crimes. There is also the Independent Domestic Sexual Violence Advocacy Service, which is in the city and the county. And one of my changes to paragraph D is actually highlighting the fact that there is a lot of work being done in the city and the county, but a county-wide strategy will better serve all the citizens of Derby. So I commend that as an additional proposal on the basis that the independent domestic violence advocates do carry a lot of good work, and we want to make sure that they enhance the work in future years within the City Council. Mr Mayor, there are many good examples of what has been done. There are online domestic abuse surgeries for young people. There's the forced marriage conference that the City Council enabled recently, and many other schemes. We need to make sure that we build on that, and my view is that the amendment enhances and more strongly communicates what the City Council wants to do and also recognises what we've already done. I commend the amendment to you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Brown.
Yes, Mr Mayor, thank you. Can I say I support the spirit of this motion that the Conservative group have put forward, but support the amendment. But can I just also take this opportunity to express my regret at a comment that I'd made, a particular analogy I'd made, as Councillor Hickson said several meetings ago. Many of you would have been present here. I accept now that actually it has caused offence to some of you. So I would like to offer my sincere apologies to anybody in this council chamber that was offended on that occasion. And I know particularly Councillor Allen, who was the particular focus of that analogy. I apologise to you, Councillor Allen, for any offence caused. And also, Mr Mayor, anybody that was listening in on the webcast that may have been offended. It is a very, very serious matter, but unfortunately in the cut and thrust of this chamber, sometimes the wrong things are said, and I regret what I'd said, and as I said, Mr Mayor, I do apologise. Thank you.
Councillor Holmes.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. That's very welcome. It takes an honourable man to do that, so thank you for that. I'm sure it's appreciated. Look, it's important we're as one with this issue, and we're happy with this amendment and we'll be supporting it. What I'd like to do is recognise the research of Domestic Abuse Oxfordshire, who papers I've referenced here. So, domestic abuse in the lesbian, bisexual, gay and transgender community is also a very serious issue, and one that I believe we should ensure is given, and well, I know we will give equal priority. Abuse is abuse, whatever gender or sexual orientation. In fact, around 25% of LGBT people suffer through violent or threatening relationships with partners or ex-partners. And that's around the same rates as domestic abuse against heterosexual women. Men also, but not to that degree. And often it's the case that in opposite-gendered couples, the problem is underreported by the victims. According to research, those involved are often afraid of revealing their sexual orientation or the nature of their relationship when this happens to them. But there are many parallels between LGBT people's experience of domestic abuse and heterosexual women, for example, including the impact on the abused partner and the types of abuses such as emotional bullying, physical aggression, threats to harm the victim or other loved ones actually in their life, social isolation, control of finances and extreme jealousy. However, there are a number of things that are unique to LGBT domestic abuse. The abuser may threaten to out the victim to friends, family, religious communities, co-workers and others as a method of some kind of control. And for many people, their sexual orientation or gender identity can become associated with the abuse, so that they blame it on being lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender. This can result in the victim believing that they're not part of the LGBT community. If they weren't part of that LGBT community or transgender, as one example, they wouldn't be experiencing the abuse. Research also seems to suggest that there hasn't been much information put out there, or even discussion in the LGBT communities about domestic abuse. And I think this lack of understanding means that some people may not believe it happens in LGBT relationships, and we need to change that and break that barrier down. They may not recognise that what is actually happening to them is domestic abuse, when it quite clearly is. And others may not know how to respond if they see domestic abuse being experienced by their friends. So LGBT communities quite often rely on friends for support within the local community, and this can make it difficult for the abused partner to seek help sometimes. They may feel ashamed about the abuse, or their partner may have to try to turn others in the community against them to stop this from getting out from their relationship and the person seeking help or even escaping from the situation. An abusive partner may also isolate their partner from contact with the LGBT community. And it can be hard for LGBT domestic victims to seek help because apparently, they may not want to disclose their sexuality to police or other organisations because sadly, we all know, I'm sure we agree, that homophobia and transphobia still exists, unfortunately, within our society. So according to research, when people do seek help, the police and other agencies may misunderstand the situation sometimes as a fight between two men, or come to that conclusion, or a fight between two men or women, rather than between a man and a woman, rather than a violent, intimate relationship with the LGBT person. And therefore, they may be discouraged if service providers use language or jump to conclusions with regards to assumptions and stereotypes. So, for example, if a woman, if she was going to disclose that her partner wasn't going to disclose what her partner's sex was, say she was in a lesbian relationship, it's important not to automatically assume that it's a boyfriend or husband, or use the word he. It's these little things that make a massive difference in the way that this can be dealt with. So if her abuser is a woman, at that point she may not feel that she can disclose this, or she may feel in some way that it may not count, which is a massive shame and a failing of the whole system. So I'm confident, obviously, that this Council will agree that this issue, and I know that the Council agrees that this issue is of great importance, and I know that everyone here, well, I assume we will, be supporting this motion as amended, and we can actually do some really good work within this Council, working with our partners and other agencies. Thank you.
Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a couple of points. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the apology from Councillor Banwaite, and if I may, I'd like to accept it on behalf of the victims of domestic violence in this city who were seriously offended by the comment. I wonder if he'd be gracious enough to send that apology also to my wife, who was deeply distressed watching it on the webcast. But a point about the amendment. I have a concern, Mr Mayor. If I look down this amendment, it says the Cabinet, all Labour, will work with the Police and Crime Commissioner, all Labour, including his assistants, and the Cross-Party Neighbourhood Overview and Scrutiny Board, majority of Labour. There's a lot been said about cross-party, and let's move on. I wonder whether it will truly be cross-party and impartial. Thank you.
Councillor Ashburn.
Thank you. Talking about the amendment, my point is simply a point of correction and clarification. In order to meet the words in the final amendment as written down, the amendment needs to have the second paragraph changed to finish in paragraph 3, not as written in paragraph 2. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
We will have a look at that.
We'll have a look at that. Can I, in the meantime, ask Councillor Poulter? Councillor Poulter.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I personally have an issue with one particular aspect of this. This motion was very carefully considered by this group in all parts. And you'll note that in the initial notice of motion, the recommendation was to set up a cross-party domestic violence review panel, a different body, because this group considers this issue so serious that whoever considers it, and I don't disagree with the items A to F in the amended motion, the work there is considerable. It's a massive project to do this project justice. And my concern is that as a member and vice chair of the Neighbourhoods panel, we're under pressure as it is in relation to the work that we have to scrutinise. We have responsibility for neighbourhoods, for all street pride, for public-facing services, which we are asked to scrutinise, but we also have responsibility for all aspects of crime and disorder. And my concern is that the Neighbourhoods Board would neither have the time or the resources to be able to do this project justice. So my recommendation would be to go with it, but to revert to the setting up of a separate panel, because whilst I agree that the Cabinet should have an input, so should the Crime Commissioner, but so should any councillor in this chamber that has an interest. Anybody that's not on the Neighbourhoods scrutiny panel, if that's the body that examines it, would not be able to do so. So I think it ought to be inclusive of all experts, all people with a responsibility for domestic violence matters in the city. And that's my view. I'd be interested in whether the chair of the Scrutiny Commission responsible thinks he will be able to cope with it and do it justice. That is the extent of my concern. If a job's worth doing, it's a job's worth doing properly. And I'm not convinced that the Scrutiny Board has the time or the resources to be able to do this motion justice. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Stanton.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As the chair of the Neighbourhood Overview and Scrutiny Board, I'd like to think that an issue as serious and grievous as this, that we would prioritise, we'd make the time, we'd find the resources. And I would also like to reiterate that Overview and Scrutiny meetings are public meetings. Any member of this chamber, or indeed members of the public, can turn up and attend those. Anyone with an interest in this subject and the responsibility that this council is taking towards domestic violence or such issues. But I'd also reassure my Vice Chair that should we require additional resources, or should our recommendation be for the setting up of a multi-party specific domestic violence group, that as an Overview and Scrutiny Board we would look to do that, if required. Thank you.
Councillor Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Like Councillor Poulter, I would have preferred the original motion, and I thought it was more direct and it made the point better. However, if the acceptors of the motion are happy with this amendment, then I will be supporting the amendment. And I'll explain the reasons why. Once upon a time, I had a male colleague that I worked with who was subject to serious domestic violence in his own life by his wife on a number of occasions. Myself and he was a really nice guy, smashing bloke. We used to have to go down to the police and prize him out and convince the police that it was his wife who was telling the lies. We eventually managed to convince him to do the right thing and divorce her. The sad part of that is he's never seen the child that he had. She's now in her 20s, but he's now happily married with other children. So I will be supporting this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Hillier.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I fully support this amendment. I also support the fact that we will be working in partnership with the Police and Crime Commissioner and also the Neighbourhood Scrutiny Board. I think the Neighbourhood Scrutiny Board is placed well because I think what we're forgetting, it could go with adults or children, but also that's one thing we're forgetting is children. So it not just affects sort of adults and all groups of adults, but children. Therefore, in society, it affects that whole sort of neighbourhood unit and families as well. So I just wanted to mention about what I think we've missed out is the impact that this has on children within a family where there is an abuser and one that's being abused. And I think also in this work that we are doing and can continue to do in partnership is the early intervention stuff as well related to that. It's well evidenced that children in families where there's an abuser or abuser, not in all cases, but in the majority of cases, go on to be an abuser themselves or go into an unhealthy relationship with a person that is the abuser. Not all cases, and it's not all also domestic violence, as mentioned, it's abuse and emotional abuse as well. And that also goes on to that child growing up and relates to problems with addiction and crime as well. But again, you know, like I say, it's evidence in some cases, not all cases. But that's why I think early intervention in this whole, and it is a massive subject, but in this whole subject needs to be taken account of as well. And not forgetting, of course, I think that's also been mentioned, that it is now also on the education agenda in schools as well. So I fully support this amended motion.
Councillor Shiraz Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I support the motion and the amendment, and I think it's an improvement on the original motion. I do believe that Councillor Hickson was sincere in putting this motion forward, and I believe Councillor Dinser is sincere as well in amending it to improve it. I worked in the domestic violence as a volunteer for nearly 18 months, and I've saw firsthand the devastation that it can cause to families. And indeed, when I became a councillor in 2004, one of my first cases was an 18-year-old girl who phoned me and said, look, you know, we need your help. And I you know, went to the house, and the husband was there. He was bleeding, and he didn't want to go to the hospital because he'd have to tell them that his wife beat him up. And, you know, eventually I had to convince him that it was a very serious injury. And, you know, thankfully he went to the hospital, got the relevant treatment, and through advice from his family, realised that the relationship wasn't working, and walked away from it. But anybody who thinks that this is a political, you know, sort of motive on this is wrong. I mean, the Liberal Democrats, again, are talking about a Labour cabinet. You know, we are a controlling group, so therefore the cabinet is ours, and it happens, right? Unfortunately, well, fortunately for the City of Derby, the Liberal Democrats won't have a cabinet that's in control of Derby, and we won't have to worry about that. But I sincerely believe that the motion and the amendment is for the betterment of the citizens of Derby, and I think we should support the amendment and recognise the motion that was put by Councillor Hickson.
Councillor Bayliss will be the last speaker on the amendment.
Just a very quick point. You may be seduced by this idea of this domestic violence review panel would be more powerful than overview and scrutiny, and in that you would be wrong. The reason for that is very simple. Overview and scrutiny, as the Chair has eloquently said, is a constituted body of this council. It has powers to hold the executive to account, no matter whether they be the same party or not, and I can assure you they do. So it is the best body to do it constitutionally, and the most effective body, and it saves having to duplicate things we do elsewhere. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, I'll put the amendment to vote. Those for the amendment? Oh, that's more or less unanimous. Any against? The amendment's carried. Now we return to the substantive motion as amended. Councillor Hickson, would you like to sum up?
Well, very briefly, Mr. Mayor. No.
Councillor Ashburn.
Yes, I wish to speak on the amended motion very briefly. I support this, but I would add one point. We must consider the effects on children who have been affected by any violent relationship. The children will need support directly, and so will those who support them, such as their schools. This requires both financial commitment and systems in place to accommodate the associated inter-organisation communication and record-keeping requirements. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Hickson.
Well, just briefly, Mr. Mayor, just to say that I've been highly encouraged by the responses that we've had from the Council this evening to the original motion and the measured amendments put forward by Councillor Dinser. I do feel that we've moved towards accepting the corporate responsibility that we have as members in this field. And I also accept the assurances put forward by the Leader of the Council and by the Chairman of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission that if we need more time or more resources are available, that they will be made available. I think that this is a great step forward in sending out a message in this city that domestic abuse in any of its forms will not be tolerated, and that we, as the policy makers and the decision makers of this city, won't stand by and see it perpetrated, and that we will do everything we can to address it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. I'll put the motion as amended to the vote. Those for the motion as amended? Any against? That's carried. The second motion concerns the Standard Committee. Councillor Hickson to move, Councillor Holmes to second.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I won't take up too much time with this one. The reason for this motion is to show that the Standards Committee as currently constituted is not really fit for purpose. And some of that is to do with the recent legislation. And that recent legislation was brought in by the coalition government, so I accept that the responsibility for the current situation is theirs and not this council's. And that legislation does two things. First of all, it doesn't require us to have a local standards committee at all. But where we do decide to keep one, and I agree that we should keep one, there are two things wrong with it. The first is, and of those two things, there is something that we can do about one of them, and there's nothing that we can do about the other. The first thing that is that we can't do anything about the position of independent members. Independent members, and we're very fortunate that we've got independent members prepared to give up their time and sit on that Standards Committee, but the legislation disenfranchised them from actually having a vote at the Standards Committee, and I don't think that is right. And that is why this motion suggests that we make representations both to the LGA and to the government to suggest that where councils decide to keep a Standards Committee, that vote should be restored to independent members if that is what councils wish. The second point is applying the Widdicombe rules to the Standards Committee, because this will always give an inbuilt majority to whoever is in control of the council. And I don't think that can be right, because it inevitably introduces bias, and there is a danger that it will lead to flawed decisions. And again, I commend Councillor Banwaite for making his full and, I believe, genuine apology to Council this evening, which was welcome and I think needed to be done. But in that particular example where that went to the Standards Committee, although the complaint, as I understand it and I'm told, was upheld, Labour then used its majority to vote against any sanction being issued, which would have led to the member being directed to make an apology to this chamber, and I don't think that's right. And I think that demonstrates, that particular example demonstrates why the Standards Committee as we've got it is not fit for purpose. For me, the only sensible way of running that Standards Committee is to do what we can to make sure that the independent members are re-enfranchised and given a vote, and that in future no more than one member from each group sits on it, so that there is no inbuilt political bias. We need to deal with this as an issue because we need to make sure that if we do have a Standards Committee, it's seen to be fair. We need to make sure that we have transparency and openness. And I do think that the corrosive effect of one party having a majority on that committee makes it unworkable. And to me, it goes against every rule of natural justice. So that's why I've put the motion down in the way that I have, and I urge the Council to support it.
Councillor Holmes.
I formally second the motion, reserve my right to speak. Thank you, Mr.
Councillor Roberts.
I have an amendment to this which I'd like to be circulated, please.
Formally second, Mr Mayor, and reserve my right to speak.
Okay.
This is so eager.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Mr Mayor, if the amendment is approved, the motion will read as follows. Council recognises that there are concerns, particularly within the minority groups, about the manner in which the Standards Committee operates. All Council committees are currently formulated under the Widdicombe procedures, and it is suggested that for the Standards Committee this should be reviewed. Council therefore proposes that the Standards Committee structure is considered as a topic review by the Resources and Governance Overview and Scrutiny Board. Council, however, is aware that the lay representation is covered by statutory guidance and as such is not within the Council's purview to amend. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. When I first read this, I didn't think that it sounded like Councillor Hickson to me. Councillor Hickson is a very good wordsmith and usually writes common sense English. But even in the first paragraph, where we get adjectives slightly all over the place, where we've got serious causes for where we should have serious concerns, and then he goes on to say we're in danger of disenfranchising the lay members. Well, I'd be interested to know how you disenfranchise somebody who hasn't got a vote. Now, it's pretty simple to me. The lay members on this committee do not have a vote. I'd be interested to know how, then, you disenfranchise them. Take something off them that they haven't got? I don't think so. So, I looked at the possibilities of what we were doing here and what we were saying. And everyone in this council chamber knows that I am no great lover of the Standards Board. In fact, when it was the Standards Board of England, I appeared before them on a couple of occasions, and I have to tell you, much to the chagrin of most of the other opposition lot, I was passed with flying colours as not having infringed these terrible rules. But the Standards Board and the Standards Committee can be abused. And I often hear the Liberal Democrats tell us that the Standards Committees and the Standards Board are there to protect the taxpayers' money. And yet, in the Labour Group room and in every other office around this building where there are former Labour cabinet members, or shadow cabinet members, I should say, who had the temerity to knock on Committee Room 5 door and say, please receive this petition. And the Liberal Democrat cabinet cowered behind the door, saying, we're frightened to come out. And Councillor Banwaite said, if you don't come out, we'll huff and we'll puff and we'll blow the door down. But they didn't come out, and they wouldn't come out. So I went round the back door and said, will you please come out? I'm fed up of standing in the corridor. And they still wouldn't come out, but what they did was report us all. You're one of them, Councillor Hussain, I remember you well. They reported us all to the Standards Board of Great Britain. And I don't mind that. But does anyone have any idea how much it costs the taxpayer of this city for us to go there and be completely exonerated? Well, the Waitman report on its own cost £50,000. You, all of you that were on the cabinet, on the Lib Dem cabinet at the time, cost this council, through the Standards Committee, £50,000. And all I'm seeking to do here is to make sure that we've got a system that does not let us get into that nonsensical position again. And the one thing that struck me was that the Conservative motion asks for the Cabinet to review the position. Why on earth would anybody with any common sense let the Cabinet review anything? They've made a decision and you're asking them to review their own decision. What I'm saying, and my group is saying, because they support this, is that this should go to an overview and scrutiny board where it can be properly discussed. And don't forget, and this is an important issue, on the scrutiny boards you cannot be whipped, so that it will be independent decisions that are made at the scrutiny board. I know you used to do it, but he can't blame us for what you used to do. And look, this is an opportunity to get some integrity into this. Look, don't start Harvey Jennings tricks on me. I know what time it is. Thank you.
Councillor Holmes.
Just a quick one, Mr Mayor. Genuinely, hand on heart, genuinely, I really enjoyed my time on the Standards Committee, and I can genuinely tell you that everyone that's brought before us to make a decision, I made an impartial decision. Nothing political, nothing whipped. And I believe that my counterparts on the committee did so as well. I hope that's the case. I'd just like to make that point that, from my point of view and the people that I know and I sat on the committee with, we were completely impartial.
You don't mind if we don't believe you, will you, mate?
Councillor Titley.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to start by, I do thank Councillor Hickson for conceding the point that actually the reason the independents can't have a vote is because the coalition government deemed that to be the way they wanted to structure this thing, i.e. the Standards Board, and since then we've been obliged to accept that. The new standards regime is in a document that this Council passed on the 23rd of May 2012. And I think it's appropriate now to reflect on the work that the former monitoring officer and staff of that time did in bringing this paper together across administrations, and the subsequent hard work that the current support staff and monitoring officer have engaged in terms of diligent, due work and thoroughness in reviewing all the cases that have come before us. And I'm sad to say, actually, that caseload has increased, because for those who don't know, I am also the Chair of Standards. I reflect on the fact that the reason that Widdicombe's based in this report, and it seemed to be an accepted principle across parties to me at the time, because it was my first meeting back on the Council, was simply because there was no other structured way of doing it. If you ask the man and woman in the street, does it seem appropriate to you that, and I think it's irrespective of the man and woman in the street's political allegiances, does it seem logical to you in a fair and democratic society that under Widdicombe, the party that's got, at that time, 28, now 27 seats, should only have one member sitting on that committee, when another party that's got 9, the Liberals, they also get one. Ditto, I think, the Conservatives with their 14. But, you know, I think Dave Roberts is right. Any committee that's been in existence for 2 years, and really this has only been in existence for 2 years because it was so heavily reformed, the standing orders and procedures were changed, is subject to review, and I'd say that whether it was in commerce or industry or within the Council. Now, the wholly appropriate way to do this is through resource and governments, and I don't think when I go to a scrutiny board meeting, in adults public health, for example, I get a walk in the park, nor should I as a Cabinet member, from the opposition members, not mentioning Councillor Webb's name, or indeed the Chair, Councillor Dinser. That should be an exercising event for the Cabinet member. And I believe that if there was a review of this process by the Scrutiny Board, I fully imagine that that Scrutiny Board would want to ask me questions about the way, they may do, assuming I was still chair of that body, how these procedures and standing orders are worked, and ask me for my views and challenge me on them. And I'm prepared to undergo that. I don't think that's going to be a walk in the park. But again, this is a constituted body of the Council. It is supposed to be non-wicked, and it is non-wicked. So I think the amendment is wholly right, and I have no problem in supporting Dave Roberts' amendment, but only to the fact that when Dave Roberts has spoken, it's rather like following the Lord Mayor's show. You can never better it. Thank you.
Councillor Barker.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. First and foremost, in answer to Councillor Roberts, I think that the legislation, in actual fact, was drawn up originally to do exactly what he said shouldn't be done. In other words, we should not be now making vexatious and frivolous complaints to the Council. That was the idea of the legislation to start with, and hopefully that's what the legislation has done, except, of course, that it was left to councils to decide, A, that they had got to still have a code of conduct, and it was left to the councils to, B, decide how they administered that code of conduct and what sanctions they brought against people who breached it. Besides that, of course, there are the criminal offences as well. The problem that we have had, and it's been pointed out by Councillor Titley, that this has been 2 years since we in actual fact passed in this chamber that very code of conduct. to my way of thinking, and I've heard what Councillor Roberts said in relation to actually taking it back to another scrutiny board, but the problem is, of course, that scrutiny board itself works under Widdicombe rules as well. And with the best will in the world, Widdicombe rules, whether we like it or not, does not give confidence to members of the public, ourselves on many occasions, the fact that it is fair and above board. And so therefore, this amendment really kicks it into the long grass as far as I'm concerned, because simply, if it was the full council that actually in fact put this procedure into place, it should be the full council, to my way of thinking, that determines that it should be amended. And the amendments that have been put forward by the councillor tonight are the ones that should actually be put there. I have to say, the law said that this was being put into place again to ensure that fairness was seen to be above board across the board in relation to the way that we conduct our business. And it said the word all. All is not only the public, it is also the independent members who are there still in the legislation but quite rightly haven't got a vote but should be taken notice of. It's there for the councillors and it's there for the officers and it's there to be seen in public in general that we operate a fair system. The system at this moment in time cannot be fair where it is politically loaded. All we're asking to do is in actual fact to redress that balance and make this a policy that can be accepted by all parties, that is fair and above board. Thank you.
Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have a question about the amendment, and it's about the independent members, because the original motion requests that we seek the LGA's guidance and government guidance to change the status of the independent members on the Standards Committee. Now, if we accept the amendment, then there will be no review of the status of the independent members. And there used to be a chief officer in this council who used to tell you that if you are making a decision, then you ought to be making it on the opinion of the person travelling on the top deck of a number 9 bus going through the city. That member of the public who may turn around and say what you're doing is wrong or what you're doing is right. And this Standards Committee has been tried and tested, and it does not seem to be giving the confidence amongst all members of this council, whether you're in control or in opposition, that the Standards Committee is producing what we would like to see, and it's not giving the confidence that members of the public would like to see in their politicians. So I have a serious issue with the amendment if we are not going to seek to lobby the LGA and government about restoring a vote for those independent members. Because to give those independent members a vote would give us confidence in this chamber, and it would also give that member of the public sat on a number 9 bus travelling through the city that things are not only being done properly, but they're seen to be done properly. You cannot have a politically loaded committee of this sort investigating fellow councillors that is judge, jury and executioner. And by the way, I do like the image of Councillor Banwaite as the big bad wolf. He does some huffing and puffing in this chamber, and I can see him fitting that role probably in next year's pantomime. So, Mr Mayor, I will be voting against the amendment.
Councillor Ashburn.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Briefly, I believe that councillors should not be allowed to police their own conduct, and, given the past ineffectiveness of this committee, I would urge any person who wishes to make a complaint regarding any councillor to contact the police directly. Thank you.
Councillor Martin.
Thank you. Very briefly, I'd just like to take exception to Councillor Barker's suggestion that the Resources and Governance Board is not fair and above board and cannot be so. I hope they would support me in saying this, but throughout this year I have worked particularly closely with the Conservative colleagues on that board. We did carry out a very successful review of the call-in procedure, and in that process we proactively sought the views of all political groups. I have every confidence that the Resources and Governance Board can look at this situation very fairly, and therefore I support the amendment.
Councillor Bayliss.
Yeah, just very briefly, it's interesting that I follow the chair of the Scrutiny Board, and I absolutely support 100% what Councillor Martin said, and I can give my assurance that in terms of recommendations from the Scrutiny Board, I hope they are free and not fettered. And I think one of the things that we're saying here is that allow the Scrutiny Board to look at everything in that. And if they came up with a recommendation that was fair, proper and balanced, and we thought that was the right way to do it, we would obviously make representation to the LGA. But I think it's a matter for them, rather than us to be prescriptive tonight. And we're very clear about this. We do believe that after 2 years there needs to be something reviewed on this. You do that naturally anyway. Let's take this as an opportunity to do it, look at the system and look at the services. But I just reflect on one thing before I finish, is that I do get the impression that people want to make complaints to the Standards Board, and some of them, to be honest, are frivolous, and then when they don't get the result, they think the Standards Board's broken. Well, maybe it's not broken, it's working exactly the way it ought to be, and some of the complaints are frivolous and trivial, and we shouldn't be using the resources of this council to do this in a particular way. It should be slightly more grown up and adult about it. But from the position of leader of the council, if the Scrutiny Board came up with the recommendations, then we'd obviously look at those and look at implementing them. Why wouldn't we? We're expecting them to do something. We're charging them with a job tonight for council. It's the right and proper thing we do. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Stenton.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is not specifically on the motion, but perhaps some of the premises that have been discussed during this debate. And just to put a few things to bed, one that has been cast aspersions upon is the independence of councillors on committees, quite broadly, and anyone who thinks that councillors of whatever political persuasion don't have their own opinions, their own views, and make these their own decisions and make these felt at committee level and all sorts of levels should maybe try and come along to a Labour group meeting sometime and actually see some difference of opinion. As for the phrase politically loaded, you can replace that with democratically representative of the makeup of the council and therefore the will of the people of Derby. And let's not forget the fact that we don't take our mandate from just being of different persuasions and different points of view, but it is actually derived from the people who elect us by majority, and therefore our committees should reflect that. And it just doesn't escape me that on the last meeting before an election, that the ever-dwindling opposition parties choose to make this point that there should be more power given to unelected independent representatives, and that, in fact, committees shouldn't be made up compared to as per the makeup of the council, but should be shared out equally between political parties. Presumably, no matter, we're afraid that we might run out of any seats altogether and have no representation on committees. But I assure you, knowing the opposition members, no matter how lonely the Conservative or Lib Dem group rooms become over the next months and years, that they'll still make themselves heard.
I think we've had sufficient debate on the amendment, so I will put the amendment to vote. Those for the amendment? Any against? I was going to seek clarification from the monitoring officer.
It means that the majority of members here present this evening have abstained from the vote, and that we've had a minority indication that voting against the amendment to the motion.
So the amendment's lost.
So the amendment is lost.
Okay, the amendment is lost. Okay. Now we return to the substantive motion. Councillor, I've not had any indication from anybody else, so I'm going to ask Councillor Hickson to sum up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I've made the points I wanted to make in terms of the inherent unfairness of the Standards Committee. It isn't like any other committee of this Council where the Widdicombe rules apply, because it's not concerned with implementing policy or practice or funding decisions or so on and so forth. And that's why, in terms of the contribution by Councillor Stanton, he completely misunderstands the role. I understand why he misunderstands that. He's fairly new and he hasn't got the experience to understand how these things work. But it is important, I think, that where we do have lay members, appointed lay members on committees, we've got them on the independent review panel, and equally we've got them on the Standards Committee, that we value the input that they've got. And it's important, I think, when adjudications and decisions are being made about conduct or complaints, that not only that justice is done, but that justice is seen to be done. And I think that the public will misunderstand why we have independent members on a committee, but then say that they can't vote. And I've put forward a mechanism where we can make representations to address that situation by lobbying the LGA and going to government, because it would only take, in my view, a statutory instrument from the Minister to alter that situation. It wouldn't need full-scale legislation. I think we could achieve that if we were determined to achieve it. I've listened carefully to all of the contributions that have been made, but at the end of the day, that Standards Committee is sitting there on behalf of the public, not to implement policy of this Council, but to make sure that this Council and the members of it behave appropriately and conform to their duties in a standard of conduct that's acceptable. I think the motion, as I originally worded it, and I don't accept Councillor Roberts' criticism that it was poorly worded, will achieve exactly what is necessary to make sure that, and I've forgotten what number bus it was, but whoever's sitting on it is satisfied that we're going about business in a correct and proper way, and that when we're making decisions about conduct and behaviour, we're doing so without political bias.
I'll put the motion to the vote. Those for the motion? Those against? The motion is lost. The third motion this evening concerns Bombardier. Councillor Hickson to propose, Councillor Holmes to second.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I hope this motion won't be too difficult. There are, in the life of the city, those cataclysmic events that become embedded as part of our civic history. The Rolls-Royce crash in 1971 was one of those events, seismic in its effect and with huge implications for the city. And here we come, fast forward 40 years to the situation that we had with Bombardier in 2011. And nobody could have foreseen that, having lost one contract to Hitachi, that a further contract would have been lost in terms of the Thameslink contract to Siemens and what the effect of that might be. And for me, as part of the delegation that went to Berlin with the Chief Executive to discuss with the senior officer at Bombardier what the consequences of not getting that contract would be, the consequence was made very clear to us. And that consequence was that we were staring into an abyss which would have seen the closure of the last surviving train maker in this country. The events that followed that meeting were astonishing. It saw the city mobilised in a way that did great credit to all that were involved. Political differences were set aside, the public were roused, and the local paper took up the cudgels, and Derby spoke, and didn't it speak clearly and loudly about what it thought about that decision. It was a defining moment in Derby's history, and one that we can all take some quiet pride in having a part in. And I think we all have particular moments that we remember as part of that process. I remember particularly a conversation with Councillor Robin Wood when we were at Bassers Rec, and he reflected on the irony of a Conservative group being part of a trade union delegation and everybody else who was there walking through this city to protest about something that had happened. Councillor Roberts referred recently in a newspaper article to the moment when I shared a stage with Bob Crow following the city centre rally. I think at that moment in time I would have shared a stage with Satan himself if it meant that we were going to save those jobs and save that company that we all valued so highly as far as Derby was concerned. So, a quiet sense of achievement, I think. The purpose of this motion is to rejoice that we still have Bombardier, to rejoice that we in our own way had a part in Bombardier still remaining in Derby, and to express our delight that they now have the Crossrail contract. And whilst we don't know what the future may hold for this important and vital firm in Derby, I do feel that it would be remiss of this council if we didn't, at this meeting, wish the workforce well for the future and to express the wish that they will remain in our city for generations to come.
Councillor Holmes.
Can I formally second this motion, Mr Mayor, and reserve my right to speak? Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Can I say that it gives me a real pleasure to stand up in this chamber and recognise the outstanding contributions that were made over the period from the time that Bombardier failed to gain the Thameslink contract to eventually them securing the Crossrail contract. It was done with great effort from a great many organisations. I'm on record as saying that I recognise that as the leader of the council at the time, Councillor Hickson did an outstanding job. I confirm that tonight. I didn't put in the Telegraph article that I wrote about the outstanding contribution of that paper. I've never seen a provincial newspaper run a campaign that consistently sought to show the shortcomings of the government procurement processes going right through from the European Union procurement procedures right through to the failure of the government's officers to have an economic impact assessment which very clearly would have made a significant difference to what happened here in Derby. And I joined with the likes of the 4 trade unions at Bombardier: Unite, the GMB, the RMT and my own trade union, TSSA. They galvanised the workforce within the factory, and they came along in huge numbers to support their employer and to support this city in seeking to secure future contracts for this city. And what that did, in a way, was to get us a few holding contracts, some small contracts, that allowed Bombardier to continue until this big contract was set. Had we not got it, I really do consider that the consequences would have been abysmal for this city. The railway industry is a very powerful industry in this city, and indeed the Derby and Derbyshire Rail Forum that Councillor Martin and myself represent the council on represents in Derby and Derbyshire over 100 different companies that are in supply chains, provide design, development, procurement, all of the things that are absolutely essential for a company like Bombardier to be able to provide the services that are necessary to make that train. And we in Derby and Derbyshire Rail Forum are very proud of that. So we are part and parcel of the railway family, and we are part and parcel of what we do in this city in terms of train making. But you may recall that last month I raised an issue about the fanzine Focus, the one that said we've got 3 staff in the Mayor's office and we have employed 3 cabinet support officers. I've written every week since then to the leader and eventually to every member of that lot over there and said, tell me who they are. And they won't tell me. And tonight they said, ask your cabinet members. I'm not asking them, I'm asking you. Give me an answer. But let me tell you the thing that stinks terribly in my nostrils, and that is this thing. How dare you, in the face of what everybody in this city did, how dare you put on the front of your Derby City News, Liberal Democrats save train making in Derby and the UK. All 10 of you. You should be ashamed of yourselves. You had very little to do with it, and my God, you take credit for anything. You're like Klondike claim jumpers. As soon as anybody gets a mine open, you're in there sticking flags in. The Lib Dems have got it. Hallelujah. It's an absolute disgrace. And you should apologise to everyone in this council who worked together, and to the Derby Evening Telegraph who worked assiduously to get that contract in Derby, that you dare indeed to claim credit for it. And I realise it's time. I had my back to the clock. I'm very sorry. I move.
Councillor Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On behalf of the Liberal Democrats, I wish to add my congratulations on Bombardier's recent success in securing the Crossrail contract. As a former apprentice on that site, I have fond memories of that site and its transition through AdTrans and ProRail into Bombardier, and I admit to being very, very concerned when they lost the Thameslink contract. I listened with great interest to the new managing director's very thoughtful contributions on Radio Derby the other morning, and I'm glad to see that this manufacturer now has a secure future here in Derby. It is vital for the city and also the region. As we heard earlier, many thousands of jobs both within Bombardier and the supply chain here. It is good to see that this work will continue. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the government for responding to the lobbying from myself and other Lib Dems. Despite what Councillor Roberts says, I personally had meetings with the Minister, as did Councillor Jones, to plead the case for getting the procurement rules changed from those put in place by the previous government that resulted in them losing the Thameslink contract. I wish the management and workforce every success in the future. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Ashburn.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We are delighted that Bombardier has at last won a Department of Transport contract, the first one recently with an invitation to tender written by a non-Labour Party government. The Labour Party has written into previous tender documents terms relating to hiding the Labour-generated debt, which benefited those organisations that had direct access to loans that were cheaper than Bombardier could access. The current government has chosen to borrow its own money at a lower rate than either would generate and to buy from a UK company. I would like to congratulate Bombardier for their success. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Higginbottom.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We can't help ourselves, can we? Such a fantastic news story, fabulous news for Derby, and we've got to do he said, she said, I did it, you did it. We all did it. I would like to echo Councillor Roberts' congratulations to the Telegraph, because they kept the story going, but I'd like to congratulate everybody involved in that movement for Bombardier at the time, and I'd like to congratulate them and wish the workforce well.
Councillor Titley.
Yes, funnily enough, when I went along as a candidate and as a then convener at Rolls-Royce to the big lobby where all party leaders spoke on the occasion that we were all rallying and trying to save the job, I didn't realise that it was the Lib Dems who'd solely done it. But then I was enlightened when I saw that newsletter. I mean, one of the stakeholders, and I apologise for having to go out during the debate, that may not have been mentioned earlier was, of course, the trade union movement in Derby and the businesses as well, that in addition to this chamber, wholeheartedly supported the retention of Bombardier. And I would not like the opportunity to be missed to mention the good work that the trade union movement did in Derby in terms of supporting their colleagues and comrades and brothers and sisters, to use the old terminology that Dave Roberts and I are so familiar with, in doing their best on many occasions, overtly and behind the scenes lobbying. So I think this chamber can be proud collectively of its achievements, not just one party. And I also think we ought to recognise the contributions from outside stakeholders that we all in different ways have associations with. So well done, Bombardier.
Councillor Hickson, would you like to sum up?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Mr Mayor. I mean, I do think that the contribution made by the Lib Dems is absolutely shameful. Motions presented that should have been magnanimous and should have had cross-party support and shouldn't have had political issues dragged into it. And the Lib Dems have to drag it down to the lowest common denominator discussion in this chamber, when what we should be doing this evening is rejoicing that the combined efforts of everyone in this city, wherever they came from, was able to change the mind of government, to change the procurement process, and to protect Bombardier, the last remaining train maker in this city. I'm hopeful now that this motion will be passed, that we will communicate the wishes expressed in this motion to Bombardier, and I reiterate, I congratulate them on the quality of their product, on the quality of their workforce, on the quality of the management that has managed to turn the company around and win this contract. And we should, all of us, be wishing them an unqualified success for the future.
I will now put the motion to the vote. Those for the motion? Any against? Carried unanimously. The fourth and final motion concerns the establishment of a democratic integrity panel. Councillor Hickson to propose, Councillor Holmes to second.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I won't take up too much time with this. The events leading up to and following the Arboretum electoral fraud case did grave damage to the reputation of this city. The fact that actual prosecutions took place was in itself a defining moment. And I was ashamed that Derby should be associated with corrupt electoral practices. It's something that should cause every member of this council and every member sitting in this chamber huge concern. The freedom to vote fairly and to have a result that is unquestionable is one of the great triumphs this country should celebrate. And up until those prosecutions took place, I thought that it was something that Derby was able to celebrate. But the dark shadow cast by the Arboretum prosecutions still looms large as far as public confidence in the voting system is concerned. the prosecutions and the publicity that went with it damaged public credibility in a system that I thought, and I think most of us thought, was beyond reproach. So the Council must now address these issues to make sure that what happened in Arboretum at that time that led to those prosecutions can never ever happen again. And that's why we have this motion before us this evening. I don't ever want to see Derby labelled again as the city where corrupt electoral practices take place. We need to get our house in order, and we need to do it in a way that is open and transparent. We need to shine a spotlight on how electoral arrangements are made, and we need to make sure that such arrangements are agreed in a process that is open to the public and to the press, and not taken, as it has been in the past, behind closed doors. And that's the purpose of this motion. Let this Council now move forward together and set up a system which is open to the press and the public, where we can draw up the arrangements that voting will be run in this city, and where all interested parties can have a say in what those arrangements are. We must never again be in the situation that resulted in those prosecutions. I have suggested in the motion that a panel is set up and that it's chaired by the Council's Chief Legal Officer, because I think that's where the responsibility lies, and I think that's where the public would expect such a panel to be chaired. It's our responsibility to make sure this happens. And I go back to the remarks that the judge made at the trial, and he said very clearly that no one who is elected by way of a corrupt election has a legitimate electoral mandate. So I hope, therefore, that the modest processes that I've put down in this motion can be agreed. I hope that we can move forward with the proposals that I've outlined, and that we never again have to face the shame that the Arboretum prosecutions brought on this Council. And I therefore move the motion.
Councillor Holmes.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I formally second the motion. I'd just like to talk briefly, actually, about my personal experience of what I sort of saw. And it was in 2008 when I was a candidate, the year I was elected. And I'm not going to mention any names. I'm making no accusations here. I'm just going to relay what I saw. I was coming to the council house and to collect a badge for somebody to go to the count. And I was just parking my bike up and a car pulled up. And somebody who is a councillor now, I'm not going to mention who they are, who was an activist at the time, and I recognised them, jumped out of the car with an armful of postal votes. Now, they were sealed, and I'm not saying that there was any wrongdoing there, but it did not sit well with me at all, and I reported it to the returning officer. And at the time, we had the groups had a written agreement between leadership that no party activist and councillor candidate would handle postal votes, as in sealed postal votes. They just would not touch them. And I know that that was instruction very firmly laid at my door as a candidate not to do that, and I didn't. And I know my fellow candidates and councillors did not do that either, and to this day we avoid that like the plague. However, it didn't sit well with me at all, and I was very concerned about what I saw. And really, there's every single election, we all hear the rumours. Now, some are more than rumours, some are investigated by the police, some don't go any further for various reasons. But I believe, my personal belief, is that fraud is still ongoing in this city. It was proven to be the case by the court case. I have concerns moving forward that we still don't have transparent elections, and if I have no confidence in the electoral process in some ways, then how do we expect the public to have that confidence? And we need to work as hard as we can to drive out any potential for fraud and fraud wherever it occurs in the city, because we all rely on that process to stand here in this chamber and have legitimacy, and we need that legitimacy. If we don't have confidence in the electoral process, then it undermines us all. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Bayliss.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. We'll be voting against this motion. The reason why is you hear Councillor Hickson reasonable, argued, and why wouldn't you agree? And then you hear the sneer by Councillor Holmes, the little dig there. We need to be supporting the returning officer of this council and the electoral staff, not undermining them. What is being called for in this motion is already in train and being done, and therefore this motion is unnecessary. Yet again, we see here an unincorporated body of the council being invented out of thin air. For what reason? Well, I think we can work that out. I can see this as one of the series of motions tonight. We have the Tory electioneering process largely in front of us, but no surprise then, it's the last meeting before the election. I also reflect on one of the things I did find interesting. In paragraph 2 of the motion as printed, it talks about concern about public confidence. Well, who was actually in charge of the council at the time that election took place? Could it be the Conservatives? But just for completeness, and for the record, I, as the leader of the Labour group, will state for the record in relation to Arboretum, no Labour member was involved in this. No allegations have been made about the Labour Party other than the attempt at this poorly veiled smear tonight, and we will rebut it and refute it at every opportunity. The Labour Party expects the highest levels of integrity for all its representatives. No Derby Labour Party councillor or official, to our knowledge, party member, was interviewed by the police in respect of this matter. That's where we are with this. That's where we need to be. And if the voters of Arboretum think there's something wrong about that, they will get an opportunity to express their opinion in May of this year. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Move to the vote.
Councillor Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be very brief. I just have here, which I have been reading, a 50-page report by the Electoral Commission on electoral fraud. It's worth reading for all of you, and I particularly draw your attention to the section on public confidence, and I can't do better than quote what it says. Evidence collected by the Commission in its review of electoral fraud revealed that fraud, a significant proportion of the public remain concerned that it is taking place. Proven cases of electoral fraud, when it is committed, the perpetrators tend to be candidates or their supporters. Voters are the victims, and sustained action is needed now to prevent fraud from taking place. Although the introduction of individual electoral registration this year will tighten up the registration, more can and should be done. Looking ahead, the time has come for England, Scotland and Wales to move towards a requirement for voters to produce ID at polling stations. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Higginbotham.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am very disappointed that the full council, cross-party, were not taking the opportunity to redeem ourselves. The last time we had this conversation, the vote that was taken from a public perspective, the person on the number 10 bus, number 10 omnibus, was that we've got something to hide. As a full council, you didn't vote for something that was going to make things even more transparent. I don't believe this motion is here to undermine officers. I think it's there to assist them, and I'll be supporting it because I don't want Derby in the newspapers again for something very negative.
Councillor Hickson, will you sum up? There are no further speakers.
Yes, I will, Mr. Mayor. Just let me go to the point that Councillor Bayliss made. If he's suggesting somehow that the Conservatives in control of this council were instructing people to act illegally at polling stations to cast votes for Labour, he's off his trolley, quite honestly. And my final comment on this motion is this. I think it ill behoves the party that benefited or allegedly benefited from these corrupt electoral practices to vote down a motion that is designed to put things right. I think that will be very badly received by the public, and I think the public will say, what have Labour got to hide? This motion is quite simple and straightforward. It wasn't there to make a political point. It was there to restore confidence in the electoral process in this city. And if Labour did benefit from the corrupt electoral practices that took place, which is what the allegation was, I think you've made a bad mistake today in voting down this motion, if that's what you're going to do.
Now put the motion to the vote. Those for the motion? Those against? Motion's lost. This concludes our business this evening. I wish you all a safe journey home.